The courtroom fell silent as Miguel Hernandez stepped forward. At 17, he looked small against the backdrop of polished wood and American flags. His worn button-up shirt was meticulously pressed, but too large for his thin frame. Judge. William Harrington glanced up, not bothering to hide his eye roll. Another immigration case, another waste of time. State your name for the record, Judge Harrington said, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years on the bench. Miguel Antonio Hernandez, Your Honor, Miguel replied, his English careful but clear. No lawyer stood beside him. And where is your legal representation, Mr. Hernandez? I will be representing myself today, Your Honor, Miguel said, straightening his shoulders. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The other immigrants waiting for their cases watched with a mixture of pity and admiration. Judge Harrington leaned forward, not hiding his condescension. Young man, this is a federal immigration court, not a high school debate club. Do you understand the seriousness of these proceedings? Miguel nodded, his dark eyes steady despite the trembling in his hands. Yes, Your Honor. I understand very well, that's why I've prepared my own case. The government prosecutor, Ms. Reynolds, shifted impatiently. She had 15 more cases to process before lunch. Very well, Judge Harrington sighed dramatically. The court recognizes the case of Miguel Antonio Hernandez. Deportation proceedings. Miguel reached into his backpack and pulled out a neatly organized folder. Your Honor, before we begin, I'd like to present evidence regarding my eligibility for asylum under Section 208A of the Immigration and Nationality Act, with specific attention to the precedent established in INS versus Cardoza-Fonseca regarding well-founded fear. The judge's pen paused mid-note. The prosecutor looked up sharply. Nobody had expected those specific legal references to come from the mouth of a teenager with no lawyer. And as Miguel continued to speak, something in the atmosphere of Courtroom 7 began to shift. Subtle at first, like the change in air pressure before a storm. 3 years earlier, Miguel had stood frozen in the doorway of his family's small home in El Salvador, staring at the spray of bullet holes across the kitchen wall. His mother's coffee cup lay shattered on the floor, but the real blood belonged to his father, a local teacher who had refused to pay protection money to MS-13. You must go, his grandmother had whispered that night, pressing their life savings into his palm. They will come for you next. The journey north had been a nightmare of hunger, fear, and moments of unexpected kindness. A woman in Guatemala who shared her tortillas, a priest in Mexico who hid him from authorities, the desert sun that made him hallucinate his father walking beside him. Keep moving, the ghost father had said. In America, justice still means something. Miguel had been 15 when he crossed the border, immediately turning himself in to Border Patrol. He remembered the holding facility, the emergency blankets, the children crying, the overwhelming smell of disinfectant. A volunteer from a legal aid group had visited briefly. I wish I could help everyone, the attorney had said, but there are hundreds of you and just a few of us. That night, Miguel had made a decision. If no one would speak for him, he would learn to speak for himself. Upon release to a distant uncle in New York, Miguel had begun his education in American law. Every day after his dishwashing shift, he would walk 2 miles to the public library. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, noticed his determination. You're reading law books? She had asked. That's university-level material. I need to understand, Miguel had replied simply. My life depends on it. Mrs. Chen became his guide, recommending simpler texts to start with, then gradually more complex resources. Miguel absorbed everything: legal terminology, procedural rules, landmark cases on immigration. By day, he washed dishes. By night, he studied immigration law like his life depended on it, because it did. William Harrington had not always been a hard man. 30 years ago, fresh out of law school, he had believed in the system. His grandfather's stories of arriving from Ireland in 1920 had shaped his worldview. Work hard, follow the rules, and America would reward you. We came the right way, his grandfather would say. No handouts, no shortcuts. As Judge Harrington watched Miguel organizing his papers, those family dinners echoed in his mind. These new immigrants wanted shortcuts, or so he had convinced himself over the years. His colleagues called him the Hammer for his tough stance on immigration cases. In his mind, he was upholding American values. His record of deportation orders was unmatched in the district. That morning, Chief Judge Myers had visited his chambers. The backlog is getting worse, Bill. We need to process these cases faster. I'm already pushing them through as quickly as legally possible, Harrington had replied. That's not what I hear. Word is you spend extra time lecturing them about respecting our laws before sending them back. Now, watching Miguel cite legal precedents, Harrington felt his irritation growing. This was supposed to be simple. The boy would plead, he would deny, next case. Your Honor, Miguel continued, the Board of Immigration Appeals ruled in matter of SP that persecution for mixed motives still qualifies for asylum consideration. Harrington frowned. He vaguely remembered that case but couldn't recall the details. He hadn't expected to need them today. Was the boy actually right? No, this was a performance, a coached routine. Someone had prepared him, one of those activist immigration groups, no doubt. Mr. Hernandez, he interrupted. Where is your evidence of persecution? Miguel reached for another folder. I have documented threats against my family, newspaper articles about my father's murder, and police reports showing no investigation was conducted. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't in the file she'd reviewed. Something uncomfortable stirred in the judge's memory, his grandfather's voice again, but different words. The hardest thing about America, William, wasn't the work. It was proving I deserved to be here. The courtroom had grown unusually quiet. All eyes were fixed on the teenager who continued presenting his case with an eloquence that seemed beyond his years. Your Honor, Miguel said, I'd like to direct the court's attention to a rarely invoked provision under Section 241b(3) regarding restriction on removal. Judge Harrington leaned forward slightly, his curiosity momentarily overcoming his skepticism. This provision was indeed rarely cited. Go on, he said, his tone cautious. This provision states that removal must be withheld if the Attorney General determines that an alien's life or freedom would be threatened because of the alien's race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion, Miguel explained. My father was targeted specifically because he was an educator who refused to allow gang recruitment in his school, making our family part of a specific social group under persecution. The prosecutor jumped to her feet. Your Honor, this is a creative interpretation at best. The social group definition has traditionally been much narrower. Miguel turned to a tabbed section of his binder. If I may, Your Honor, in the case of Matter of Acosta, the Board of Immigration Appeals defined a social group as sharing a common, immutable characteristic. In the more recent case of Henriquez Rivas v. Holder, the Ninth Circuit recognized witnesses against gang violence as a particular social group. Judge Harrington blinked. The boy was right. From the back of the courtroom, a woman in a pressed suit leaned forward, her pen moving rapidly. Barbara Martinez from the Legal Times had covered immigration courts for 15 years, and she'd never seen anything like this. I have here affidavits from 3 teachers who worked with my father, testifying to the threats he received after preventing gang recruitment at his school. I also have documentation showing that 8 educators have been killed in my region for similar stands. Judge Harrington found himself reaching for the documents, actually reading them instead of simply going through the motions. The signatures looked authentic. The school letterhead matched. The newspaper clippings corroborated the pattern of violence. The court will take a 15-minute recess, Judge Harrington announced suddenly. Ms. Reynolds, I'd like to see you in my chambers. As he stood to leave, he noticed something he hadn't before. A small group of high school students in the back row, apparently there on a civics field trip. Their eyes were wide, watching as an unexpected lesson in justice unfolded. When court resumed, the atmosphere had changed. The government prosecutor had 3 additional legal books open before her. Judge Harrington's reading glasses were perched on his nose, a rarity in his rapid-fire deportation hearings. "Mr. Hernandez," Ms. Reynolds began, her tone sharper, "while your legal citations are interesting, they don't address the matter of credibility. You entered the country illegally, waited years to file for asylum, and have no corroborating witnesses present." Miguel nodded respectfully. "I understand your concern. Regarding my delayed filing, I direct the court to matter of YC, which established that the 1-year filing deadline for asylum has exceptions for unaccompanied minors, which I was at the time of entry. As for corroboration," he paused, then continued with quiet confidence. "The Real ID Act of 2005 states that an applicant's testimony may be sufficient without corroboration if the applicant satisfies the trier of fact that their testimony is credible." Judge Harrington leaned forward. "That's correct, Mr. Hernandez, but the same act gives me discretion to require corroborating evidence unless you can show that a reasonable person couldn't be expected to provide it." A small smile touched Miguel's lips. The judge had engaged with his argument instead of dismissing it. "Precisely, Your Honor. And I submit that requiring corroboration from family members would be unreasonable since my father is deceased and my mother is in hiding. However," he reached into his folder, "I do have sworn affidavits from my former neighbors and my father's colleague, notarized by the American Embassy in San Salvador." For the next 20 minutes, a remarkable legal duel unfolded. The government prosecutor cited cases supporting limited interpretations of asylum law. Miguel responded with precedents favoring humanitarian considerations. The courtroom audience watched in disbelief. The translator had stopped working entirely. This level of English and legal terminology was beyond what she typically needed to convey. Most surprising was Judge Harrington himself. His questions were no longer dismissive, but probing. "In your reading of INS versus Stevic, Mr. Hernandez, how do you reconcile the clear probability standard with your situation?" Miguel's answer was thoughtful and precise. When he didn't know something, he admitted it directly, a honesty that contrasted with the prosecutor's occasional overreaching. By the session's end, the usual power dynamic had shifted. Miguel stood straighter. Ms. Reynolds looked frustrated. And Judge Harrington, known for checking his watch during immigration hearings, hadn't glanced at the time once. "We'll continue after lunch," he announced. "Both parties should be prepared to address the question of whether Mr. Hernandez's family constitutes a particular social group under current BIA standards." As the courtroom emptied, the whispers began. Something remarkable was happening in courtroom 7. Judge Harrington sat alone in his chambers, his half-eaten sandwich forgotten. His fingers traced the worn edges of a photograph he kept in his drawer. His grandparents standing on Ellis Island, exhaustion and hope mingled on their faces. "We came the right way," his grandfather had always insisted. But had they? William had been 16 when his grandfather, after too many whiskeys, had admitted the truth. "The papers weren't all in order, Willie," he'd confessed. "Your grandmother was supposed to be rejected, tuberculosis. But there was this Irish doctor who slipped her through. Said everyone deserves a chance." William had never told anyone this family secret. It contradicted the narrative he'd built his life around, the narrative that justified his hardline approach. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Judge Melissa Carter, his former mentor, stood in the doorway. "Quite the case you've got, Bill," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "The whole courthouse is talking about the teenage legal prodigy." Harrington frowned. "He's well prepared, probably coached." "By whom?" Melissa asked, raising an eyebrow. "The public defenders are drowning in cases. The pro bono attorneys are stretched thin. This boy taught himself. You don't know that. I spoke with the librarian from his neighborhood while you were in recess, Mrs. Chen. She's been helping him research for almost 2 years. Said he's the most determined person she's ever met." Harrington's frown deepened. Determination doesn't change the law. No, Melissa agreed, but it might change the judge. She leaned forward. Do you remember why you became a judge, Bill? The question struck him like a physical blow. Of course he remembered. After law school, he'd worked as a public defender before moving to the prosecutor's office. He'd seen both sides. He'd wanted to be fair. When had that changed? Melissa stood to leave but paused at the door. You used to say that a judge's job wasn't just to apply the law, but to make sure justice was served within its boundaries. I miss that, Bill Harrington. Alone again, he turned back to the photograph of his grandparents. What would they think of Miguel Hernandez, a boy who had crossed deserts and studied by night to stand in an American courtroom and fight for his future? When Judge Harrington returned to the courtroom, something subtle had changed in his demeanor. The perpetual frown had softened. His eyes, normally avoiding direct contact with immigrants, now looked directly at Miguel. Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness, Miguel announced as the afternoon session began. Judge Harrington looked surprised. Witness? This isn't a full hearing, Mr. Hernandez. This is a preliminary review. I understand, Your Honor, but Federal Rules of Evidence 614 grants the court discretion to call witnesses in the interest of justice. I've brought individuals whose testimony directly addresses the questions raised by Ms. Reynolds. The judge hesitated, then nodded. Proceed. A distinguished man in his 60s approached the stand. Please state your name and occupation, Miguel requested. Dr. Thomas Reyes, professor of Latin American Studies at Columbia University. For the next 15 minutes, Dr. Reyes explained the systematic targeting of educators by gangs in El Salvador, providing context that transformed Miguel's personal tragedy into part of a documented pattern. Miguel's second witness created a stir, a retired NYPD officer named James Morales. I met Miguel 2 years ago, Officer Morales testified. There was a fire in our apartment building. While everyone was running out, Miguel ran back in. He saved my 4-year-old granddaughter who was trapped on the 3rd floor. And did Miguel know you were a police officer? Miguel asked. Yes. He'd seen me in uniform, and he knew that being undocumented and interacting with law enforcement could lead to his deportation. He risked everything to save a child. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Judge Harrington found himself watching Miguel with new eyes. The final witness was Mrs. Chen, the librarian. She described Miguel's relentless study, his volunteer work helping younger children with homework, the tutoring program he had started for at-risk youth. He doesn't just want to belong here, Mrs. Chen said softly. He already contributes here. From the jury box, where observers sometimes sat during immigration proceedings, an elderly woman dabbed at her eyes. Your Honor, Miguel said, I have one more piece of evidence. He submitted a folder containing dozens of letters from community members, teachers, and the children he tutored. These are the people who would be affected if I were deported, because our lives are connected now. Judge Harrington accepted the folder, noticing the tremor that had returned to Miguel's hands. For all his legal knowledge and poise, he was still a 17-year-old boy fighting for his future. The court will recess until tomorrow morning, the judge announced. I need time to review all this evidence properly. As people filed out, the reporter from the Legal Times approached Miguel. How did you prepare all this by yourself? Miguel's answer was simple. I had no choice, and I believe in American justice. Judge Harrington, overhearing this, felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Doubt about a deportation order he'd considered routine. That evening, Judge Harrington remained in his chambers long after the cleaning staff had gone. Legal books lay open across his desk. Miguel's file sat prominently before him. The law was clear in many respects, yet the more he researched, the more he discovered the very flexibilities and exceptions Miguel had cited. The boy hadn't invented loopholes. He'd found the humanity already built into the system. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Ms. Reynolds, the government prosecutor, stood at his door. My superiors are concerned about the precedent this case might set if the court grants favorable consideration based on compelling personal circumstances rather than strict legal criteria. Judge Harrington raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting the government's interest is in maintaining deportation statistics rather than correctly applying the law? Ms. Reynolds looked uncomfortable. I'm saying that exceptions lead to more exceptions. Where do we draw the line? Perhaps, he replied slowly, the line has been drawn too rigidly for too long. When she finally left, he returned to his research with renewed focus. There was a precedent he vaguely remembered from law school, a case involving a different kind of asylum claim, but with a judicial opinion that had struck him as particularly wise. Meanwhile, in a small room borrowed from a community center, Miguel sat surrounded by his supporters. Mrs. Chen adjusted his tie. Officer Morales reviewed his concluding statement. Dr. Reyes offered strategic advice. You've done everything possible, Mrs. Chen assured him. Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already achieved something remarkable. Miguel nodded, but his eyes betrayed his fear. For all his legal knowledge, he remained a teenager facing the destruction of the life he'd built. I keep thinking about the other kids in detention, he said quietly. The ones who don't speak English, the ones without anyone to help them study law books. Across town, Judge Harrington finally found what he'd been searching for. A 1987 case with a minority opinion written by Justice Stevens. The purpose of our immigration laws is not merely to regulate entry, but to strengthen America through the contributions of those who demonstrate the very qualities upon which this nation was built: courage, determination, and a willingness to work against overwhelming odds. Harrington closed the book slowly. Throughout his career, he had prided himself on being strict but fair. Now he faced an uncomfortable question. Had he been strict at the expense of being fair? He thought of his grandfather's secret, the Irish doctor who had bent the rules, seeing not just a tubercular woman, but a human being deserving of chance. By midnight, Judge Harrington had made his decision. It would likely be controversial. His colleagues might question it, but for the first time in years he felt certain he was fulfilling his actual duty as a judge. The next morning, courtroom 7 filled beyond capacity. Word had spread about the unusual case. Law students squeezed into back rows. Court staff found excuses to observe. The reporter from the Legal Times had been joined by colleagues from other publications. When Judge Harrington entered, those who knew him noticed subtle differences. His posture less rigid, his expression more thoughtful. Before we continue, he began, I want to address a matter of procedure. This court has discretion in how it considers evidence in asylum cases. After reviewing relevant precedents overnight, I've determined that full consideration of Mr. Hernandez's circumstances is not only permissible, but necessary for a just application of our immigration laws. Miguel sat perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Something was happening, but he couldn't yet tell if it favored him. Mr. Hernandez, the judge continued, your legal arguments have merit. Your understanding of complex asylum provisions demonstrates remarkable diligence. But law is more than precedents and statutes. It is a living framework designed to create order while preserving human dignity. The courtroom remained utterly silent as Judge Harrington removed his glasses and spoke with unexpected candor. I have presided over thousands of immigration cases. I have applied the law as I understood it, but I have sometimes forgotten that behind every case number is a human being with hopes, fears, and potential contributions to our society. What do you say? Officers exchanged glances. Clerks stopped typing, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. The foundation of our legal system rests not just on consistent application of rules, but on the principle that justice must account for individual circumstances. The mechanized processing of human lives through our immigration courts has perhaps caused me, to lose sight of this fundamental truth. Ms. Reynolds, the judge turned to the prosecutor. The government's position that Mr. Hernandez fails to qualify for asylum relies on narrow interpretations that, while technically defensible, ignore the broader humanitarian purposes of asylum provisions. Would you agree? Put on the spot, Ms. Reynolds hesitated. Your Honor, the government must maintain consistent standards, even at the cost of sending a promising young man back to face the people who murdered his father, Judge Harrington asked quietly. Your Honor, Ms. Reynolds began again. While Mr. Hernandez's personal story is compelling, we must consider the precedent. Precedent works both ways, Counselor, Judge Harrington interrupted. Every time we choose rigid enforcement over reasoned compassion, we set a precedent too. Every time we treat immigration law as merely a mechanism for exclusion rather than a pathway for those who embody American values, we diminish the law's moral authority. Court staff who had worked with Harrington for years watched in amazement. Maria, his clerk, felt tears threatening. This was the man she'd hoped she was working for all along. This court will not be remembered for how many people it processed, or how quickly it reached decisions. It will be judged by whether its rulings reflected both the letter of the law and the spirit of justice that gives that law meaning. As the judge prepared to announce his decision, Miguel realized that regardless of the outcome, something profound had already happened. A system that had seemed impenetrable had revealed its human heart. Judge Harrington straightened the papers. Before him, the courtroom so silent that the shuffling of documents seemed thunderous. In the matter of Miguel Antonio Hernandez, this court finds the following, he began, his voice measured and clear. First, the petitioner has established credible fear of persecution based on his familial relationship to a victim of gang violence. Second, the petitioner has demonstrated that he belongs to a particular social group, family members of educators who opposed gang recruitment, that faces specific targeting in El Salvador. Miguel held his breath. These were positive findings, but judges often acknowledged fear before denying relief on technical grounds. Furthermore, Judge Harrington continued, the court recognizes the petitioner's extraordinary efforts to understand and work within our legal system as evidence of the very qualities our nation purports to value: determination, self-improvement, and respect for the rule of law, properly understood. Therefore, under the provisions of Section 208 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, this court grants the petitioner's application for asylum. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Miguel sat perfectly still, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. Additionally, Judge Harrington continued, I am ordering a review of similar cases this court has adjudicated over the past 3 years, where family connection to victims of targeted violence was a factor. Ms. Reynolds, please inform your office that I will be requesting a stay of removal for those cases pending this review. Now the murmurs became a buzz of astonished conversation. This wasn't just a single favorable decision. It was a judge publicly reconsidering his approach to an entire category of cases. The elderly woman in the jury box began to applaud, and soon others joined her. Judge Harrington rapped his gavel, but without his usual sternness. Order, he said, though his voice lacked its customary edge. This court is not a theater. Miguel finally found his voice. Thank you, Your Honor, he said simply, his composure finally breaking as tears formed in his eyes. Judge Harrington, nodded. Mr. Hernandez, this country will benefit from your presence. Don't make me regret my decision. I won't, sir, Miguel promised. As people filed out, the reporter from the Legal Times rushed to file her story. Immigration judge's unexpected ruling may signal policy shift. Miguel found himself surrounded by well-wishers. Mrs. Chen hugging him tightly, Dr. Reyes shaking his hand, Officer Morales clapping him on the back. What will you do now? Mrs. Chen asked. Miguel looked around the courtroom at the place that had transformed from an arena of fear to a site of possibility. I'm going to study, he said. I want to become an immigration attorney. There are thousands of others who need someone to speak for them. From the doorway of his chambers, Judge Harrington overheard this comment. For the first time in years, he felt something that had been missing from his work. The sense that he had not just applied the law, but had allowed it to fulfill its highest purpose. 5 years passed. The wood-paneled lecture hall at Columbia, Law school buzzed with anticipation as students gathered for the annual Immigrant Justice Lecture. Posters announced the event. From Defendant to Defender, A Journey Through America's Immigration System, by guest speaker Miguel Hernandez. At 22, Miguel had changed. The thin, nervous teenager had become a confident young man in a crispy suit, but the same determination still burned in his eyes. 5 years ago, he began, I stood in a courtroom convinced that I would be sent back to die. Today, I stand before you as a second-year law student with a story about how one moment of justice can transform many lives. In the back row sat former Judge William Harrington. He had retired 2 years earlier, his final years on the bench, marked by a striking shift in his approach to immigration cases. Judge Harrington's ruling in my case led to the review of 73 similar cases, Miguel explained. 59 of those deportation orders were eventually reversed. That's 59 lives changed. And those people have gone on to become nurses, teachers, business owners, and parents raising American children. From his seat, Harrington listened with a complex mixture of pride and humility. After his retirement, he had approached the law school about establishing a clinic focused on immigration cases. After the lecture, a reception brought together an unlikely group: Miguel, Judge Harrington, Mrs. Chen, Officer Morales, Dr. Reyes, and Barbara Martinez, whose article on Miguel's case had launched her career covering immigration policy. I've been following your clinic's work, Miguel said to the former judge. 27 successful asylum cases this year alone. Harrington nodded. Good students, dedicated, like you were. Dr. Reyes approached with a young woman. Miguel, there's someone I'd like you to meet. This is Lucia Vega, recently arrived, from Guatemala. Her situation is complicated. She needs legal guidance. Miguel extended his hand. I'm still a student, but I can help connect you with resources. Lucia looked at him skeptically. You cannot understand what it's like to flee violence, Miguel interrupted gently. To cross borders not knowing if you'll live or die. To face a system designed to send you back. I understand perfectly. Something in his voice convinced her. As they moved to a quieter corner to talk, Judge Harrington watched thoughtfully. You know, Barbara Martinez said, joining him, your ruling didn't just change his life, it changed immigration law. The Harrington standard for family-based persecution claims is now cited in law schools. He shook his head. I just applied the law correctly, finally. He's the one who's creating a legacy. The system is still broken, Harrington acknowledged. For every Miguel, there are hundreds without his resources or determination. But change happens case by case, Martinez replied, story by story. The small immigration courtroom was nearly identical to the one where Miguel had faced judgment 7 years earlier. But Miguel Hernandez now sat on the other side of the room. At 24, he was the youngest attorney at the Immigrant Justice Clinic, still finishing his final year of law school while representing his first clients. Today's case felt like looking in a mirror. 17-year-old Carlos Menendez had fled Venezuela after his journalist mother was imprisoned. Like Miguel years before, Carlos had taught himself English and prepared his own asylum application. All rise, the clerk announced, as Judge Sandra Wilson entered. Known for her strict interpretation of asylum law, she had a reputation similar to Harrington's before his transformation. From the back of the courtroom, former Judge Harrington watched silently. Now working as a consultant for the clinic he had founded, he had come to observe his protégé's first solo case. A crucial moment came when Carlos addressed the court directly. I learned about law from YouTube videos in the detention center library. I watched the story of an immigrant who represented himself and won asylum. His name was Miguel Hernandez. I thought if he could do it, maybe I could too. Judge Wilson's gaze shifted to Miguel. You're that Miguel Hernandez? The case before Judge Harrington. Yes, Your Honor, Miguel acknowledged. A subtle shift occurred in the judge's demeanor. Not yet a transformation, but a crack in the wall. Procedure. The government attorney, a young woman named Sarah Patel, presented the usual arguments against asylum. During a brief recess, she approached Miguel in the hallway. "I read about your case in law school," she said quietly. "It made me want to work in immigration law." "On the government side?" Miguel asked, surprised. "The system needs good people." "On both sides," she replied. "Fair enforcement matters too." When court resumed, Judge Wilson's questions had a new focus. "Mr. Menendez, I see you've been volunteering as a translator at a medical clinic while awaiting your hearing." "Yes, Your Honor," Carlos replied. "Many patients don't speak English or Spanish but indigenous languages. I learned Quechua growing up so I can help." As the hearing neared its conclusion, Miguel made his final argument. "Your Honor, asylum law exists not just as a protection against persecution, but as recognition that those who seek shelter often become our most dedicated citizens." The following week, they gathered again for Judge Wilson's ruling. After careful consideration, Judge Wilson began. "This court finds the petitioner's claim of persecution based on family association with political opposition to be credible and well-founded." Carlos grabbed Miguel's arm in disbelief as the judge granted asylum. But what followed was even more surprising. "Furthermore," Judge Wilson added, "I wish to commend both counsels for their professionalism. This case has reminded me that behind every file number is a human story deserving of full consideration." Outside, spring sunshine bathed the courthouse steps. Carlos was calling his uncle with the news, his face transformed by joy. "What happens now?" Miguel asked his mentor. Harrington gestured toward Carlos, then to the courthouse. "He builds a life. You continue your work. Other lawyers watch and learn. Other judges reconsider their approaches. Case by case, person by person, the system bends toward justice." Miguel nodded, remembering the terrified teenager he had once been. "It's never just about one case, is it?" "No," Harrington agreed, "but it always starts with one." Together they watched Carlos, his future suddenly wide open. In his joy, Miguel recognized the gift he had received years ago. Not just a legal decision, but a recognition of his humanity and potential. And in that recognition lay the true power of justice, not merely to apply laws, but to transform lives and the systems that govern them.
What do you think would happen if we all approached our judgments with a willingness to see beyond our preconceptions, like Judge Harrington eventually did? Miguel's journey reminds us that behind every case number, every stereotype, and every quick judgment lies a human story worth hearing. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone saw your true potential when others didn't? Or perhaps you've been the one to change your perspective about someone else? The power to transform lives often begins with the simple act of truly seeing another person. This story isn't just about immigration or legal systems. It's about the moment we choose to see humanity, where before we only saw labels. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember to subscribe for more stories that explore the extraordinary moments that transform ordinary lives.